To the aces of the Luftwaffe, the self-proclaimed masters of the European sky, the sight of America's newest fighter was comedy. The first time the P-47 Thunderbolt lumbered into view above occupied France in the spring of 1943, the Germans couldn't hold back their laughter. Ein fliegende Milchflasch, they jeered a flying milk bottle. The thing was enormous, nearly 8 tons when fully loaded, double the weight of their sleek Focke-Wulf 190s. In their eyes, this wasn't a fighter. It was a blunder with wings, proof that American engineering was as crude as it was overconfident. And for a time, it seemed they were right. In the airfields of southern England, where the wind carried the smell of oil and wet grass, American pilots were just as skeptical. Many were fresh from flying the elegant Spitfire, the kind of machine that felt alive in your hands. Then came the P-47 heavy, unresponsive, slow to climb a truck with wings. In the dispersal huts at Debden or Boxted, young lieutenants stared at the hulking silver machine outside and muttered that it looked more like a barn door than a fighter. Jug, they called it, for its squat shape, short for juggernaut, though few said the second word yet. Outside, the rain traced lazy paths across the canopy glass. A ground crewman in a grease-stained jacket leaned against the wheel strut, shaking his head at this great machine that took 2 tractors just to tow across the mud. Across the channel, in a smoky Luftwaffe mess hall, German pilots laughed over their schnapps. "Let them come," one ace said. "We'll swat these flying cows from the sky before breakfast." But that laughter was whistling in the dark. By early 1943, the air war over Europe had become a brutal chess match played 3 miles above the earth. The German Luftwaffe were still the grandmasters. Their Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs were instruments of lethal precision, flown by veterans who had ruled the skies since the Blitz. Against them, the 8th Air Force was learning the cruel arithmetic of daylight bombing. B-17s were going down in flames over Bremen and Schweinfurt, and every week brought another funeral formation on the runway. The U.S. Army Air Corps needed a miracle, a fighter that could climb high, dive fast, and keep pace with the bombers all the way to the heart of Germany. They needed something that could stand the cold, thin air of 30,000 feet and survive the storm of flak and cannon shells waiting there. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was their answer, though few believed it at first. When it first entered service with the 4th and 78th Fighter Groups, disbelief hung in the air, thicker than the English fog. Pilots complained that the Thunderbolt took forever to get off the ground, that it guzzled fuel, and handled like a drunk ox in a turn. "If we take this thing to France," one pilot quipped, "the Germans will laugh themselves to death before we get there." But as the days passed and the missions multiplied, those who flew her began to notice things, little things. The cockpit was roomy, a small luxury, when you spent 6 hours over enemy territory. The engine, though sluggish to start, felt unshakable once it roared to life, its deep radial growl vibrating through the frame like a heartbeat. There was something about that power, hidden beneath the clumsy skin, something not yet understood. Still, the early results were dismal. On April 8, 1943, the Thunderbolt's combat debut turned farcical when a fighter sweep over France had to be aborted. American radios couldn't communicate properly, forcing the entire fleet to refit with British equipment. Worse, in the first 2 months, the P-47s flew over 2,000 sorties and downed only 10 enemy aircraft, while losing 18 of their own. Luftwaffe pilots quickly learned how to exploit the Jug's weaknesses, drag it into low-altitude turning fights where the German fighters reigned supreme. In the air, the Thunderbolt looked clumsy and slow. On the ground, its pilots grumbled, and the laughter in German hangars grew louder. In the Luftwaffe's eyes, it was the perfect embodiment of America's misguided philosophy: build everything bigger, heavier, louder. Strength without finesse, brawn without brains. But beneath that laughter lay a blind spot, a failure to understand what kind of war was coming. The P-47 wasn't built for the dogfights of the previous decade. It was an instrument of a new kind of war, one waged at altitude where engines gasped for air and the limits of human endurance froze solid behind oxygen masks. It was a machine designed not for grace, but for endurance. Not to dance, but to strike, survive, and strike again. The men in England couldn't see it yet. The men in Germany refused to. But soon enough, the milk bottle would pour steel instead of cream, and the laughter that echoed across the mess halls of Europe would die in the roar of a different kind of storm. If you've made it this far, I'd love to hear from you. Where are you watching from, and how did you first learn about the P-47 Thunderbolt? Maybe someone in your family served in the Air Force, or perhaps you've heard stories about those flying milk bottles from the war. Share your name, location, and any little story or thought you have in the comments below. Every comment is a small piece of history, and who knows, your story might be featured in the next episode. The story of the Thunderbolt didn't begin in the skies over France. It began years earlier in the mind of a Georgian immigrant who dreamed of building a machine unlike any the world had seen. Alexander Kartveli, thin, sharp-eyed, and perpetually exhausted, had already designed several fighters for Republic Aviation, but by 1940, the world had changed. Europe was burning, and America knew it couldn't stay neutral for long. When the U.S. Army Air Corps handed Kartveli a new order, build an interceptor that can match the Luftwaffe's best, he didn't start with elegance or maneuverability. He started with one simple principle: power conquers all. In the hangars of Republic's Long Island plant, Kartveli stood over the blueprints of what would become the P-47 and muttered words that his engineers would never forget. "It will be a dinosaur," he said quietly, "but it will be a dinosaur with good proportions." And a dinosaur it was. Nearly 10,000 pounds empty, over 17,000 fully loaded. To put that in perspective, its German rival, the Focke-Wulf 190, weighed less than 9,000. But the bulk wasn't indulgence, it was necessity. The beating heart of the monster was the Pratt Whitney R-2800 double wasp, an 18-cylinder radial engine producing 2,000 horsepower. It was one of the most powerful piston engines ever built, and to make it breathe properly at high altitudes, Kartveli paired it with a General Electric turbo supercharger, a marvel of modern engineering that demanded an enormous fuselage to house its complex web of pipes and ducts. At the time, engineers at GE's Lynn plant worked through sleepless nights trying to solve the heat problems of this new turbo. It was a labyrinth of stainless steel tubing that ran from the engine to a turbine at the back of the fuselage. Hot exhaust gas spun the turbine, which in turn drove a compressor that forced pressurized air back into the engine. The entire system glowed red-hot in flight, and if the airflow balance was even slightly off, it could melt itself apart. But when it worked, it was revolutionary. Still, none of this genius mattered to the men who had to fly the thing. When the first production Thunderbolts reached England in early 1943, they landed on long, rain-slick runways that strained under their weight. Ground crews cursed as the big tires sank into the mud. Pilots used to nimble Spitfires climbed into the P-47's broad cockpit and stared at the sprawling instrument panel that seemed more suited for a bomber. The canopy framed the world like the windshield of a truck. The plane's control stick felt heavy, stubborn. You didn't fly a jug, you coaxed it. Lieutenant Jack Red Wilson of the 4th Fighter Group later wrote in his diary, "You don't so much take the P-47 off the ground as convince it to go. When that big prop starts biting air, she growls like a bear, and the whole world shakes." Kartveli, halfway across the Atlantic, knew this frustration well. He had designed not for agility, but for survival, for a sky of freezing air and cannon shells, where grace meant nothing if you couldn't come home. He built a fortress that happened to fly. The Jug's early trials, however, were humbling. Its climb rate was poor. It took precious minutes to reach altitude, burning through fuel that had already consumed like a thirsty giant. At forward airfields in England, its long takeoff roll meant pilots sometimes ran out of runway entirely. You had to pray, one ground crewman said, that she'd lift before the hedgeline. Then came April 8, 1943, the day of its combat debut. A fighter sweep over France was meant to be the Thunderbolt's grand entrance, the chance to silence the doubters. Instead, the mission turned into farce. American radios malfunctioned en masse. Pilots couldn't coordinate or even hear their own wingmen. The entire operation had to be called off mid-flight. When they returned, soaked and embarrassed, they learned the solution was to rip out their American radios and replace them with British sets. The laughter from the RAF pilots was good-natured. The Germans would not be. For weeks afterward, the Jug's performance charts were read like post-mortem reports. In 2 months, 2,000 sorties, 10 kills, 18 losses. The Luftwaffe had learned the new American plane's weaknesses and exploited them ruthlessly. Get it low, force it to turn, outmaneuver it, and it would die heavy and slow. In the mess tents, frustration boiled. Pilots who had once flown the Spitfire missed its nimbleness, its poetry in the sky. The P-47, by comparison, felt like a steel fist wrapped in lead. Yet even as tempers flared, a few noticed something the Germans had not. In a dive, the Jug didn't just fall. It plummeted like a meteor, faster than anything they'd flown before. When it leveled out, the wings didn't tear. The structure didn't groan, it simply kept going, Cartvelli's dinosaur was clumsy on the ground, awkward in a turn, but it had bones of iron and lungs that could breathe where others choked. It wasn't built for their kind of war. It was built for the one that was about to begin. The laughter in Luftwaffe mess halls faded for the first time that summer, not because of rumors or statistics, but because of something no one had expected. The P-47 began to climb. Slowly, at first, stubbornly, and then with the kind of purpose that made even the most confident German ace frown behind his oxygen mask. At 25,000 feet, where the air turned thin and engines gasped for breath, the clumsy American brute was only getting started. The secret was hidden deep inside its gleaming frame, a mechanical cathedral built around the Pratt Whitney R-2800 double wasp engine. It was not just an engine. It was a force of nature. 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rings, each one roaring in a synchronized inferno of controlled violence. Together they produced more than 2,000 horsepower, and later, with water injection, nearly 2,800. No piston engine in the war could match its combination of raw power and endurance. German pilots, used to the hum of liquid-cooled Daimler-Benz and BMW engines, didn't yet understand what they were facing. Those engines were like violins, elegant, responsive, but fragile. The double wasp was a drum, loud, relentless, impossible to silence. Where a cannon round might rupture a coolant line on a Messerschmitt and send it spiraling down in smoke, the Thunderbolt's radial design meant no vulnerable tubes or radiators at all. It was air-cooled, and the dense ring of cylinders acted as armor as much as propulsion. In the maintenance sheds of the 56th Fighter Group, mechanics began collecting stories that sounded like tall tales. Planes limped home with cylinders blown clean off, with wings torn open, even with oil gushing down the canopy. And yet the engine still throbbed, dragging the battered airframe across the channel to safety. The pilots began to whisper it with awe. The Jug doesn't die easy. But it wasn't just the engine. It was the miracle of the General Electric turbo supercharger that made the Thunderbolt a killer at altitude. The system was a labyrinth of pipes that twisted through the fuselage like veins. Most aircraft lost power as they climbed. Their superchargers stole energy from the engine to stay alive. But the P-47's turbo ran on waste on the exhaust itself. The hotter and harder the engine worked, the stronger the boost became. Inside that cavernous belly, exhaust gases spun a turbine at 20,000 revolutions per minute, compressing thin air and hurling it back into the engine's lungs. Above 25,000 feet, when Luftwaffe engines wheezed and starved, the Jug was just hitting its stride. The air was blue-black up there. The horizon curved and distant, and the temperature could freeze tears solid against a mask. Pilots would look down and see the world beneath them, patches of sunlit cloud, tracer lines arcing faintly upward, and realized they were flying in a place few machines could survive. When the Thunderbolt finally dove, it was like a mountain falling from the sky. Gravity seized its weight and turned it into velocity. The altimeter spun like a clock gone mad, and the sound inside the cockpit rose to a thunderous howl. Luftwaffe pilots who tried to follow often found themselves in disaster. Compressibility, the deadly shudder that tore wings from aircraft, claimed German fighters long before it reached the jug. The P-47's massive frame simply shrugged it off. And when it fired, the heavens erupted. 8 50-caliber M2 Browning machine guns, 4 in each wing, spat out more than 100 rounds per second. The tracers streaked forward, not as bullets, but as rivers of white-hot light. A single burst could saw a bomber in half. Pilots called it throwing a wall of lead. You didn't need to aim like a duelist. You only needed to put the enemy somewhere in front of you and hold down the trigger. German ace Günther Röhl would later describe it as industrial execution. It wasn't a duel anymore. It was production line destruction. And still, the stories grew. The most famous came on June 26, 1943. Major Robert S. Johnson, of the 56th Fighter Group, was returning from a mission when he was ambushed by a flight of FW-190s. His P-47 was shredded over 200 bullet holes. His canopy shattered, hydraulic lines, gone, his left arm bleeding. The plane caught fire. Then miraculously the flames died as he dove. Trapped in the cockpit, unable to bail out, Johnson flew on. Over the channel, a lone German fighter found him, its pilot, Luftwaffe ace. Egon Mayer closed in for the kill. He fired burst after burst, cannon shells tearing into the Thunderbolt. Yet Johnson refused to fall. Finally, out of ammunition, Mayer pulled up alongside the ruined American plane. Through the cracked canopy, the two men locked eyes. Mayer saluted, perhaps in respect, perhaps in disbelief, and banked away. Johnson's jug, held together by will and steel, made it home. That story raced through the squadrons like fire through dry grass. The P-47 wasn't just a fighter, now it was a legend in the making. German pilots began to speak of it with a kind of wary superstition. It drinks lead, one said. It drinks it and spits it back. The milk bottle had revealed its first terrible secret. It wasn't made of glass. It was forged of iron and breath. By the autumn of 1943, the Thunderbolt had shed its reputation as a clumsy brute. It hadn't changed its shape, but its pilots had learned how to let the monster loose. They were led by men like Colonel Hubert "Hub" Zemke, commander of the 56th Fighter Group, a thoughtful, restless tactician who saw what others missed. The jug wasn't a knife fighter, it was a hammer. And hammers, he taught his men, don't dance, they strike. Zemke gathered his pilots in the chill morning light of boxed chalk diagrams on a blackboard behind him. The room smelled of coffee, cigarette smoke, and damp wool. Forget dogfighting, he told them. That's what the Germans want. We fight the way this plane wants to fight, fast, hard, vertical. Thus was born the tactic that would turn the air war upside down, boom and zoom. It was beautifully simple. The Thunderbolt would climb higher than the enemy, sometimes above 30,000 feet, using its turbocharged lungs to own the thin air. From that frozen perch, the pilots would look down and wait. When they spotted a target below, they'd push the nose over and dive. Gravity, once the jug's enemy, now became its most ruthless ally. At 500 miles per hour, the P-47 was nearly untouchable. The heavy fuselage sliced through the air with a scream that made even veteran pilots tighten their harnesses. In those seconds of descent, they were no longer men and machines. They were guided missiles, flesh, and aluminum fused into one streak of violence. A burst from 8 Brownings tore through the sky, shredding a Messerschmitt before its pilot even realized what hit him. And then, before anyone could counterattack, the Thunderbolt would rocket upward again, climbing back into the clouds, ready for another strike. There was no graceful duel, no circling and measured combat like Knights of the Air. It was over in seconds, a brutal, efficient execution. The Luftwaffe's finely honed dance of turns and rolls suddenly meant nothing. They couldn't fight what they couldn't catch. The Germans began to notice. Intelligence reports, which had once mocked the flying milk bottle, now warned of a new danger. They called the P-47 Höhenjäger the high-altitude hunter. Its appearance above the bomber streams spelled trouble. If they are above you, one German ace told his squadron, you're already dead. Zemke's Wolfpack, as the 56th came to be known, perfected the method. They hunted in coordinated packs of 4 to 6 stacking altitude like layers of a trap. They attacked out of the sun, diving in a chain reaction of strikes. The air above Europe became a killing ground where the P-47 wrote its own rules. But it wasn't just tactics that changed. The machine itself was evolving. Republic engineers, learning from hard experience, gave the Thunderbolt a bubble canopy, replacing the old Razorback design with its deadly blind spot. Now, the pilot could see in all directions, a crucial gift in a sky that offered no second chances. Then came the paddle blade propeller with broad, curved tips that bit into the air more effectively. Suddenly, the sluggish Jug could climb like a predator. The heavy fighter that once took forever to leave the runway now surged upward with ferocity, narrowing the gap with its German rivals. Pilots who had once cursed the plane now loved it with a soldier's loyalty. Lieutenant Francis Gabby Gabreski, one of Zemke's men, called it the best friend a pilot could have. He knew what he was talking about. Gabreski would go on to become America's top ace in the European theater, scoring 28 kills, almost all of them in a P-47. The tactical shift changed the entire rhythm of the war in the air. Now, when American bombers flew into Germany, Schweinfurt, Regensburg, Bremen, they were no longer easy prey. Thunderbolts flew high above invisible guardians, waiting for the first sign of a Messerschmitt diving in. Those who tried were met with a storm of fire from above a steel curtain that tore through the Luftwaffe's best formations. During the Great Big Week of February 1944, when the Allies launched an all-out air assault on the Reich's aircraft factories, the Thunderbolts were there, fast-diving escorts weaving between bombers and German interceptors, their 8 guns blazing. The Luftwaffe lost hundreds of planes that week. The joke was long dead. The fear had begun. Zemke's doctrine spread through every fighter group in England. Pilots who had once grumbled about the Jug now quoted his mantra, "Get high, hit fast, don't turn." The skies of Europe became a vertical battlefield where altitude was life and speed was salvation. On the ground, in the hangars and the pubs, pilots started speaking of the P-47 with a new tone, half respect, half reverence. They still called it the Jug, but now the nickname had changed meaning. It was no longer a milk jug. It was the Juggernaut. By the end of 1943, when Luftwaffe patrols glimpsed those bulky silhouettes circling high above the clouds, they didn't laugh anymore. They checked their fuel, scanned the sun, and prayed they'd get home before the storm fell. The Hunter had found its form. The sky, once German blue, now belonged to the Thunder. By early 1944, the thunder of the Jug had grown so familiar that even German civilians could recognize it. The deep, rolling growl of the R-2800 wasn't just the sound of a plane, it was the sound of inevitability. But in that same year, the P-47 faced an unexpected rival, its elegant cousin, the P-51 Mustang. The Mustang could fly farther deep into Germany and back, and quickly became the premier long-range escort of the 8th Air Force. For a lesser machine, this might have spelled retirement. For the Thunderbolt, it meant rebirth. The U.S. Army Air Forces reassigned the P-47 to a new role under the 9th Air Force as a fighter bomber, a low-flying hammer built to break the German war machine before D-Day. The transition was seamless. Everything that once made the Thunderbolt awkward, at dogfighting its weight, its bulk, its brutal strength, now became its greatest advantage. It was a plane made for destruction. The Germans would come to know it by a new name, Jabo, short for Jagd Bomber. To their ground troops, that word was whispered with dread. In the months leading to June 1944, the skies over occupied France became a hunting ground. From Normandy to the Ardennes, from the rail yards of Rouen to the crossroads of Caen, Thunderbolts stalked everything that moved. They screamed down at treetop level, their wings vibrating from the recoil of 8 50-caliber guns, spitting death into convoys' trains and fuel depots. A single flight of P-47s could cripple a railway line in minutes. Their pilots learned to strike with terrifying efficiency, drop their 500-pound bombs, rake the survivors with machine gun fire, then vanish into the horizon before the smoke cleared. Each Thunderbolt could carry 2,500 pounds of bombs, more than some light bombers, along with 10 5-inch HVAR rockets, each capable of piercing a tank's armor. For the German panzer divisions, once the spearhead of Blitzkrieg, the sky had turned against them. Their columns, once invincible on open ground, now froze in fear when they heard the distant growl of radial engines. You could feel the air itself tremble before they came, recalled one German infantryman captured in Normandy. We would drop everything, hide under trucks, even dive into ditches. And still, they found us. It wasn't just destruction, it was psychological warfare. The Germans called it Jabo fever. Soldiers would dive for cover at the mere hint of a P-47's engine. Entire supply convoys halted by day, creeping forward only under the cover of darkness. On June 6, 1944, D-Day, the P-47s were there from the first light of dawn. As Allied troops stormed the beaches, Thunderbolts swept inland, smashing gun positions, convoys, and communication lines. Over the hedgerows of Normandy, their cannons stitched fiery scars across the countryside. In those crucial first weeks, they destroyed thousands of vehicles, cutting off reinforcements and isolating German units. Their pilots became legends, not just for their kills, but for their toughness. Low-level flight was the most dangerous work imaginable. The ground was alive with gunfire, machine guns, flak, and even rifles blazing upward in desperation. A P-47 pilot would often return to base with the wings, shredded tailhold, or fuel tanks leaking, but alive. As one flyer put it, there isn't a P-47 pilot alive who'd rather bail out than belly one in. She'll bring you home. In the weeks after D-Day, the sky over France belonged to them. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, had been driven into its own airfields. The few German fighters that rose to challenge were swarmed and destroyed before they could even reach the front. What remained of Germany's strength was on the ground, and that's exactly where the jug was hunting. Thunderbolts became flying artillery. They pulverized bridges, shredded columns of trucks, and left entire rail lines twisted and useless. From June 1944 to VE Day, they would claim an almost unbelievable tally: 86,000 railroad cars, 9,000 locomotives, 6,000 armored vehicles, and 68,000 trucks destroyed. The arteries of the Reich were being severed one by one. To the men on the ground, both friend and foe, the sight of a P-47 diving out of the clouds was unforgettable. Allied infantry often cheered as they passed overhead, roaring so low the slipstream bent the grass. Our angels of death, one soldier called them, not out of fear, but gratitude. For the Germans, it was different. Their once proud armor divisions crawled through the mud like wounded beasts terrified of the sky. Even the sound of a tractor engine could spark panic. By the autumn of 1944, the Luftwaffe's dominance was not just broken, it was buried beneath 1,000 burning convoys. The P-47 had gone from the most mocked aircraft in the sky to the most feared name, whispered in every foxhole from Normandy to the Rhine. What had started as a joke had become a doctrine of annihilation. The Jug was no longer merely a fighter. It was the storm itself. By late 1944, Europe was a continent devoured by industry's shadow. The war in the air had become a contest not only of skill, but of production, of who could forge more steel, refine, more fuel, train more men. And in that arena, the United States had become a force of nature. The Republic Aviation Plant in Farmingdale, New York, once a modest airfield surrounded by potato farms, now roared day and night. Sparks showered from welders' torches, engines thundered on test stands, and a river of aluminum flowed down the assembly lines. At its peak, A new P-47 Thunderbolt rolled off the line every single hour. In total, over 15,600 Thunderbolts would be built between 1941 and 1945. Each one a fortress of rivets and faith. Each one a message written in metal to the Luftwaffe. We can build faster than you can destroy. The R-2800 engines, over 125,000 of them, came not just from Pratt Whitney, but from Ford and Chevrolet plants retooled for war. Car mechanics became aircraft fitters. Teenage girls who once sewed dresses now stitched canvas around control surfaces. It was America's industrial miracle, and the Thunderbolt was its avatar. For the Germans, trapped under a rain of bombs, that miracle was a nightmare. Their factories in Bremen and Regensburg were craters. Fuel was running out. Young men barely out of flight school were being rushed into cockpits with less than 100 hours of total flight time. They faced American pilots with 4 or 5 times that experience, and machines that could outlast, outgun, and outnumber them. The Luftwaffe's proud cadre of aces, men like Galland, Barkhorn, and Rahl, watched in despair as their squadrons dwindled. Each loss was irreplaceable. There were no reserves left, no endless pipeline of pilots to fill the gaps. The air war had become a grim equation, and Germany's side of the balance sheet was bleeding red ink. Meanwhile, the Americans had turned replacement into ritual. Pilots lost one week were replaced the next. Crews rotated in and out with mechanical precision. Behind every P-47 stood an army of ground crew armorers, mechanics, electricians who kept the jugs flying no matter how battered they returned. In muddy English airfields and makeshift strips in France, these men worked with frozen fingers, hammering out bullet holes, swapping engines, and painting over new scars before dawn. One such man, Sergeant Mac McCarthy, of the 78th Fighter Group, once said, "You learned to love the plane like it was a friend you patched up after a bar fight. She'd come home shot to hell and you'd whisper, 'You did good, girl. Let's fix you up for tomorrow.'" In those tents and hangars, the Thunderbolt became a living symbol of endurance. Its skin might be patched with mismatched panels, its propeller nicked and scarred, but every morning it thundered back into the sky. Life on the ground was its own war. Mechanics stole moments of rest between sorties, leaning on fuel drums, their faces blackened with oil and smoke. Pilots gathered in the ready room staring at the mission board, their laughter forced and brittle. Some scrawled names on their planes: Tallahassee Lassie, Miss Fireball, the Arkansas Traveler. Each nose art was a small rebellion against the machinery of war, a touch of humanity on a steel leviathan. Inside the cockpits, men found courage in routine. The pre-flight checklist was a prayer mixture: rich prop, high RPM fuel, main tank. The engine roared, propeller blades blurred, and the entire airframe shuddered as if straining to be free. A thumbed photograph of a sweetheart or a child was tucked near the altimeter, something to come back to. Across the channel, German pilots were running out of everything: fuel, ammunition, even hope. Many were barely trained before being thrown into the sky against Thunderbolts and Mustangs. They fought bravely, desperately, but the sky itself had turned against them. Every sortie burned fuel they could not replace. Every kill cost them men they could not retrain. By 1945, the air war had lost its chivalry. It was no longer a duel of knights. It was an industrial storm. And the P-47 was its steel-tipped spear. Each sortie, each bomb, each returning plane repaired overnight was another equation solved in the language of attrition. America didn't just fly more planes, it produced more possibility. Every bolt tightened in Farmingdale echoed across Europe in the form of another German convoy, torn apart, another airfield reduced to ash. The Luftwaffe had begun the war with brilliance and courage, but it was fighting a machine that could not tire. In the end, it wasn't just the Thunderbolt that destroyed the Luftwaffe. It was the idea behind it, a nation that could turn steel, sweat, and time into an unstoppable storm. The German ace, Adolf Galland, once said bitterly, "We were not defeated by men, but by production." He wasn't wrong. The Thunderbolt was more than a fighter. It was America's factory floor, made flesh, a symbol of the terrifying efficiency of modern war. And still, as the factories roared and the machines thundered eastward, the men who flew them were just that men. Young, frightened, determined. Each one, a small heartbeat, inside the vast mechanical pulse of the Allied war machine. They didn't think of industry or strategy. They thought of getting home, of one more mission of keeping their promise to the men who didn't. The Jug would make sure they did. By the spring of 1945, the sky over Germany was no longer a battlefield, it was a verdict. Swarms of silver aircraft roared across the horizon so dense they seemed to turn daylight to shadow. In that endless thunder, the war's ending could already be heard. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, was shattered. Its aces were ghosts, its airfields graveyards of twisted metal and scorched concrete. And among the squadrons circling above it all, one machine stood as both symbol and sentence, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. In just 2 years, the flying milk bottle had rewritten its destiny. From its first disastrous sorties to its final campaigns, the Jug had become one of the most feared and respected aircraft of the war. The numbers alone told a story beyond dispute: over 500,000 combat sorties, a kill-to-loss ratio of better than 4-to-1, and thousands of enemy aircraft tanks and vehicles destroyed. But statistics only hinted at what it meant to those who lived beneath its shadow. On the ground, German soldiers whispered its name the way sailors speak of storms. The deep growl of its engine meant that no road, no bridge, no train was safe. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt lamented bitterly that movement by day has become impossible. To him, it wasn't an aircraft, it was inevitability made of aluminum and fire. The airmen who flew the Thunderbolt knew it too. They returned from missions with planes riddled by bullets, paint scorched black by flak oxygen masks crusted with frost. Yet, more often than not, they came home. They would climb down from the cockpit knees, shaking, pat the warm cowling of the R-2800 and whisper the same phrase over and over. She got me back. The war had changed them. In 1943, they were boys in borrowed uniforms, staring at an ungainly machine no one believed in. By 1945, they were veterans, hard as the rivets that held their aircraft together, flying in formation through the smoke of a crumbling Reich. They had watched cities burn, seen comrades vanish into the cloud, and learned that courage in war was often measured not in heroism, but in endurance. As the Allies pushed across the Rhine, the P-47 found one final role. It prowled low over Germany's highways and forests, obliterating anything that moved: fuel convoys, troop trains, even retreating columns trying to surrender. The Jug had started the war as a defensive escort. It ended it as the angel of vengeance for an entire army. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, the men of the Thunderbolt squadrons gathered on their airfields, looking across lines of battered, soot-streaked planes. Some of the aircraft bore names and pin-up art. Others were plain silver, but everyone told a story of stubborn defiance. They had been mocked as dinosaurs. Yet here, they stood survivors of a new kind of war. In the months that followed, many P-47s were scrapped, melted down into the peace they had bought with fire. Others flew on in the Pacific or in the air forces of nations rebuilding from ruin. But their spirit endured. The idea that had birthed them, an aircraft built around sheer resilience and overwhelming firepower, would echo decades later in a new machine, the Fairchild Republic A-10 Thunderbolt II, the Warthog. Different war, same philosophy. Another flying fortress that refused to die. For historians, the P-47's triumph is a study in adaptation. A flawed beginning turned to dominance through innovation, teamwork, and relentless production. For those who flew it, the story is simpler. It's the story of a machine that looked after its pilots, of a nation that learned to turn its factories into weapons, and of laughter that turned to fear. Adolf Galland, the Luftwaffe's own general of fighters, would later be asked what truly defeated Germany's air arm. He didn't name a battle or a strategy. He looked toward the empty sky and said, "The endless waves of American fighters. They darkened the daylight. They hunted us to extinction. That was the Thunderbolt's final victory, Not a dogfight won, but a sky conquered. As dusk fell over Europe, the last jugs of the 8th and 9th Air Forces taxied to rest engines, ticking as they cooled. Mechanics leaned on their toolboxes, pilots lingered by their planes, the silence feeling foreign after years of thunder. One by one, the airfields went dark. But in the cooling metal of those engines, in the smell of oil and cordite, and victory, something remained, a heartbeat of the industrial age, steady and unyielding. The P-47 had begun as a joke and ended as a juggernaut. It was proof that even in the most mechanized of wars, the spirit of men and the machines they built could transform ridicule into reverence. And in that quiet after the storm, with Europe at peace, for the first time in 6 years, the last echo of the Thunderbolt's engines rolled across the empty sky, a sound equal parts memory and warning. When I think about the story of the P-47 Thunderbolt, I see more than just a machine. It's the story of how determination, innovation, and the quiet courage of ordinary pilots turned a laughingstock into a legend. It reminds us that strength isn't always graceful, and that sometimes the most underestimated things, like a bulky, stubborn fighter, can change the course of history. If stories like this make you see the past in a new light, consider subscribing and joining our growing community of history lovers. There are many more forgotten battles, machines, and human moments waiting to be rediscovered together.